Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get started with chapter 4. So we've been talking about job order costing, and that is when you have a job that has a job number and it's going to go through the system where it's either one large item or it could be a batch of the same items going through the process, and we have to figure out how we're going to allocate the costs. So the last 2 chapters we went over what that looks like and how do we move material from raw material into the work in process, and then same with labor coming into work in process and manufacturing overhead, and then we move to finished goods. So we're basically going to be doing the same thing, but with process costing, it's going to be a little bit different. We're not going to have a job number. So we allocate a little bit different. So we're going to go through that tonight. Okay, so there are some similarities between the two systems, from the job order and from the process costing. So both systems will assign material, labor, and overhead. So remember, we have those direct material, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. That's our 3 buckets. So we're going to take those costs and assign them to the products, and they provide a mechanism for computing unit product costs. So we're still going to be doing that, and we still have those estimated predetermined rates that will be applied, and your actual going to your manufacturing overhead. We won't focus on that as much as what's actually happening with the material. That's what we're going to be going over tonight. How do we have the units? How are they flowing through? What does it look like when you have large batches that are not assigned to a job? So both systems use the same manufacturing accounts, the manufacturing overhead, raw materials, work in process, finished goods. If you sell it, it's going to be cost of goods sold. So all that's the same. So no new accounts. That'll be the easy part, is knowing where the money's going to be flowing. And then the flow of the cost through the manufacturing accounts is basically the same with both systems, which is what we just went over. Sorry, I just got distracted. My phone rang. All right, differences between the job order costs and process costing. So job order costing, just like I said, there are many different jobs are being worked during the period, and each have that unique production requirement. The costs are accumulated by the individual job, and we use a job cost sheet so that we can track that particular job. How many units did we produce? What was the cost per unit? Or if it's that one big ticket item, how much did it cost versus, what those estimates were. And then we have process costing. Process costing is a single product that's produced either on a continuous basis or for a long period of time. All the material, all of the units are going to be exactly the same. We're not deviating. They're going to be, maybe you're producing at the plant a bunch of pudding or tapioca, and it's all the same. So it's not going to be a job number. We just have this single product that's produced on a continuous basis. The costs are accumulated by department. So that is a little bit different than what we looked at before. And then the unit costs are computed by department as well. So we'll walk through an example of that later in the chapter. All right, so first question. Process costing is different for products that are A, different and produced continuously, B, similar and produced continuously, C, individual units produced to customer specifications, or D, purchased from vendors. So which one sounds like process costing from my description that I just gave you? A, B, C, or D?
B, similar and produced continuously.
Correct.
D, yep.
Yep. So it's going to be that product that's, the same, and we're going to be producing it on a continuous basis. So B is correct. All right, any unit in an organization where materials, labor, or overhead are added to the product. So let's look at those processing departments. We're going to go through 2 and look to see how we're going to assign the cost. So the activities performed in a processing department are performed uniformly on all units of production. So whatever that department is doing, it's doing it for all of the units. And then the output of a processing department must be homogeneous, which means it's the same, it's not changing. And products in a process costing environment typically flow in a sequence from one department to another. So we're taking raw materials, we're bringing them into, let's say, your first department. You're going to do something with it, and then it's going to pass it on to the next department. You may also have some raw materials from that next department pulled, as well as whatever's coming out the department that, produced something on that unit first. So it could be in stages. All right, so let's go through the flow of the cost again. So remember those three buckets: direct material, direct labor, manufacturing overhead. They're still moving into work in process. The work in process will come out and go to finished goods because we'll have a finished product at the end. And then if it's sold, it's going to go to cost of goods sold. So that's all the same. Nothing's changed. So in the job order costing system, when we pull in all of the direct materials, labor, manufacturing overhead, we're putting it onto a job in that work in process with that job number that's unique. And we keep track of it on that job costing sheet, and then it moves out into finished goods. With the process costing, it's a little bit different because now they're traced and applied to the department, not to the job number. So that's the only difference in the flow. So for purposes of this example, assume we have two processing departments, Department A and B, and we're going to use a T account and journal entry so you can see the flow of what is actually happening. All right, so here's our T account. We have our accounts for raw materials and work in process. Work in process, they're separated by department. We have Department A and Department B. So we could pull direct materials, which is those raw materials that we're using on these processes for the unit in Department A and Department B. So some things may be brought into A and assembled together and then pushed on to B, but B may also be pulling some raw materials in as well and adding to whatever Department A has done. So we have two different departments here. We're pulling direct material out. So what are those raw materials? That's an asset account, and it sits normally as a debit. So if we want to reduce that raw material, we're going to have to do a credit to reduce it down. To pull those materials out, we'll have to do a credit. So that's one side of the entry. The other side is going to work in process, which is also an asset account sitting on the balance sheet. And because it's pulling into that department, we're increasing what's happening in work in process. So we have to put a debit. So we'll separate it out by the Department A and Department B. So that'll be our two debits and our raw material as a credit. All right, so now we have labor, direct labor. So we have people working in Department A and Department B that are in the process of producing those units. So we have to pull that out. We know we're going to have to pay them later. So whenever we have to pay somebody labor, that means that we're liable to pay them, and that becomes a liability, right? So we owe them in the future. So we're using salary and wages payable. That's my credit. It normally sits a credit balance until you're ready to pay it out. So we're not looking at any of that side of the transactions. We're just looking to see what happens with the cost on the job. So we're going to do a credit for the payable, and then the debit is going to go into the work in process, Department A and Department B. Here's the journal entry. So again, we have two different debits because we have to split the cost in A and B. And then we have that liability set up as a credit for the salary and wages payable. All right, now we're looking at manufacturing overhead. So remember, we talked about manufacturing overhead. We have that applied number. That's that estimated number that we came up with for manufacturing overhead. We're not going to look at that tonight. We've already done that. But it's the same thing is happening on the flow of process costing. So you can see we're going to credit manufacturing overhead for that applied work in process that's being applied to the work in process. And we have the actual overhead that's going in as a debit. Now, when we pull it out of manufacturing overhead, we have to put it into the work in process. So we're moving it in, we have to increase it. So we're going to debit that side. So remember, the left side of the T account is a debit, the right side is a credit. All right, here's the journal entry. So 2 debits again, Department A and B, and then we're crediting manufacturing overhead. All right, so far what we've looked at is what we've done in the past. The only difference is we had those 2 departments. So let's look at the T account now that has both departments. So let's say Department A has brought in direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. They have done their part that they need to do in their department for this particular product. And now we're done with it, and we need to pass it on to Department B so they can do what they need to do with it. So it's sitting as a debit on the balance sheet in the work in process. It's an asset account. So in order to reduce that down, I have to do a credit. So it's on the credit side, whatever I'm pulling out. And what's going into Department B is coming into that asset account. So it's going to be a debit. So we're just taking out of one and we're transferring it over to the Department B. And there's the journal entry. So Department B's now getting those products, those units. So they're going to have a cost associated with that. That's your debit for Department B. It's coming out of A. So I'm going to reduce A by doing a credit. All right. So when it's completed in Department B, in our example, that means our product is finished and it's ready for sale as a finished good. So once it's completed in entirety, we want to pull it out. Well, when we do that, we have to calculate what our cost of goods manufactured. We looked at that last week. So we'll figure out what it is. We'll credit the work in process account for Department B, and we'll pull it out and put it over into finished goods. So it's just moving from one asset to another, coming out of work in process, moving into finished goods. So it's the same thing as what we did with job order costing. So the difference is that we went through 2 different departments this time, and now we're pulling out a B as a finished product, and we're going to move it into finished goods. So in this example, with the way they're showing us, it's not coming out of Department A as a finished good. Department A will take some material and have their labor and have their manufacturing overhead cost it. They'll put together a part of the product, and then they'll pass it on to Department B. Department B is also pulling raw material. They're finishing the product. They come up with a finished good in the end, and they will pull it out of Department B and put it into finished goods. So now we have that finished product, and it's going to sit there in that account as an asset because that's our inventory for finished goods. It's going to stay there until we sell that product. All right, so here's my journal entry. Finished goods, getting the debit, and then work in process. We're decreasing that account because we're pulling them out. They're finished. So we're going to put a credit in Department B. All right, so now our product was sitting in finished goods. So now we have a product that we can sell. So now that we can sell it, we have to remove out all the units that were sold. How do we do that? We have a finished good. It's an inventory on the books. We're going to sell it. We have to reduce that account to get it out of our inventory. So we have to do a credit. We're going to move it into our cost of goods sold. That's our debit. And remember that reduces our revenue amount. So the difference between the revenue and the cost of goods sold is what you made on the product. All right, so now when the order is fulfilled and units are sold, the cost of units is transferred to that cost of goods sold. So here's the journal entry. So we have cost of goods sold as a debit, finished goods we're reducing because we've pulling product out, we've sold it, so we got to put a credit on the books. Okay, so in process costing, each department needs to calculate 2 numbers for financial reporting. This is where we're going to learn something new here. So the cost of its ending work in process inventory and the cost of its completed units that were transferred to the next stage of the production process. The key to deriving these 2 numbers is calculating unit costs within each department. Okay, so we're going to have each department, we have to figure out those unit costs. There's 2 methods for performing the computations. We have the weighted average and the FIFO. And if you remember from that principles class, FIFO means first in, first out. We are not going to focus on that method in this class. We're only going to look at the weighted average method. All right, so we have characteristics of the weighted average method. So this method makes no distinction between work done in the prior and current periods. It just blends it together. And the units and the cost from the prior period and the current periods. Okay, so we're just blending those together. And then B, we have the equivalent units of productions for a department that are the number of units transferred to the next department or the finished goods. So remember, it goes from department to department, or it goes from department to finished goods, plus the equivalent units in the department's ending work in process inventory. All right. So we have our conversion costs. Conversion costs, we have direct labor costs that are often small in comparison to the other product costs in the process system. So we'll look at that in just a second. So this chart helps you see what your conversion costs are. So we have direct labor and manufacturing overhead that are combined into one classification of product costs called conversion cost. So if you have a problem that's asking about conversion costs, you want to make sure that you know that those two items that go into the conversion costs are your direct labor and your manufacturing overhead. All right. So we have direct materials and then we have that conversion cost. That's the direct material, direct labor and the manufacturing overhead, both costs together. So if you have a problem that separates them out, you want to make sure you include both. All right, then we have our equivalent units. So an equivalent unit is defined as the product of the number of partially completed units and the percentage completion of those units. So it might seem a little bit confusing, but we're going to go over it in a problem and it'll make a little more sense. So it's the partially completed units, the number of those, and you multiply it by the percentage that's been completed of those units. And then we have the equivalent unit needs to be calculated because a department usually has some partially completed units in its beginning and ending inventories. So we're going to calculate out what the equivalent units are. We're going to look at the cost so that we can have a cost assigned with it so that we know what's in the beginning or what's in the ending inventory. We have to have a number for that. So these partially computed units complicate the determination of a department's output for a given period and the unit cost that should be assigned to that output. We'll walk through an example, so hopefully it makes a little more sense in just a minute. All right, so here's that equation at the top. Equivalent units, number of partially completed units times the percent complete. So let's look down here in the little definition. It's just basically this first sentence is what it said on the previous slide. It's again just telling you what it is. It's a product of the number of partially completed units and the percentage completion of those units with respect to the processing department. Okay, so this little sentence here, oops, let me go back. Well, now y'all know the answer to that one, but we'll still work through it. Hang on one second. All right. I was trying to highlight this second sentence, but can't do that when it's in presentation mode. So let me see if I can grab a highlighter in the Zoom software. I thought maybe it had one. I don't. Let me see what this is. Nope, it's not that. Okay, I don't see a highlighter. All right. So I'll just do this. So right here, the equivalent units, this sentence is the number of completed units that could have been obtained from the materials and effort that went into the partially completed units. So it's a number of completed units that could have been obtained from the materials and effort that went into the partially completed units. So let's do an example right here. So we have, assume Department A has 500 units in its ending work in process inventory that are 60% complete. All right, so we have 500 units that are partially completed, and the percentage completion is 60%. So there's your two numbers that you need. Okay, with respect to the processing in that department. So these 500 partially completed units are equivalent to 300. And they just multiplied. It's 500 times the 60% to get the 300. So Department A's ending work in process inventory would contain 300 equivalent units for the period. So we're calculating it out so that we know what our ending inventory is, okay? So we have 500 units, 60% complete, we multiply, we get 300, and so that becomes the work in process inventory at the end of the period. 300 equivalent units. All right, so for the current period, Jones started 15,000 units and completed 10,000 units, leaving 5,000 units in process, 30% complete. All right, so we have a total of 15,000, and he tells us that in this example, we have 10,000 units we know that are completed. So these are done, these are complete. And then it has 5,000 units that are partially completed, they're at 30%. Okay, and it wants to know how many equivalent units of production did Jones have for the period. So it wants to know how many. So we know we have 10,000 units that was completed and pulled out. Then we have to do the math to calculate out the 5,000 times the 30%. So we have the 10,000 and we have the 1,500. So all together is the 11,500. So that's how we get answer B. Okay, and there's the work. So it shows you the 10,000 units plus the 5,000 units times the 30%. Okay, Smith Company reported the following activity in the assembly department for the month of June. So they're giving us this information. The work in process on June 1, so that's our beginning balance, we had 300 units. Percent complete was 40% and 20%. Then we started 6,000 in production for June. And the units completed and transferred out of Department A during June was 5,400. And our work in process at the end is 900. So we had a beginning balance of 300. Then we have 6,000 that we started in production. We transfer out 5,400. So that leaves us with 900 left over that's not completed yet. Okay, so 300 plus the 6,000 less the 5,400 that was moved out of Department A gives us our balance of 900. So now we have 900, and it's telling me that 60% of the materials are complete of that 900, and 30% of the conversion costs are completed for that 900. Okay, so we're looking at it with direct materials, and remember, conversion costs was at labor and manufacturing overhead. So we're looking at both of those, and they have a different percentage on both. All right, so let's begin the calculating of the equivalent units. You start with what was transferred out. So what was transferred out, it was given to us, it was 5,400. So we put 5,400 for both materials and conversion. Those came out. All right, now we know for materials, 900 units was the ending balance, 60% was complete at the end. So we calculate it by doing 900 times 60%. That gives me 540 for my materials. I add those together. The equivalent units of production in the department for June for materials was 5,940. And then I'm going to calculate out the conversion cost. So I do the same thing, 900 times that percentage, which was 30%. So I have 270. So the equivalent units in production at the end is 5670 for conversion. All right, so the equivalent units of production always equals the units completed and transferred. So that's the number that we were given, what was transferred out, plus the equivalent units remaining in work in process. So that's the equivalent units. That's how we calculate that. We add the units completed plus the equivalent units that are remaining in work in process. All right, so this just breaks it down a little bit different, showing you that we started 6,000 units. We began with 300 units and they were 40% complete. We had 5,100 units that started and completed. In the end, we were left with 900. So how many units were completed? We had 5,400, the 300 plus the 5,100. That's our units completed, 54. Remember, they told us that was what was moved out. And then we had that 900 times 60%, which is 540. So we have the 5940 equivalent units. So it's basically the same thing we just looked at. It's just looking at it a little bit differently. So that's for materials, and we're going to look at it for the conversion as well. So we're doing the same thing. We had those 300 units in the work in process in the beginning. Then we had 5,100 units that we started and completed, because we had a total of 5,400 that was completed for the month. We calculate the equivalent units for the ending work in process, which was 900 times 30%. So we have 5670 equivalent units in the conversion. All right, are y'all with me so far? Do y'all have any questions yet?
I had a quick question about the percentages. So are those gonna be like given to us, or like do we have to like figure out something like to get those numbers, like the percentages?
Yeah, I think that most of the time I don't think that you ever have to figure that out. I think it's given to you.
Okay, thank you.
But yeah, you won't know how to calculate it if it doesn't give it to you. Okay. All right. This out the way. So we're going to compute the cost per equivalent unit. So in order to compute the cost, we have to get some cost numbers. So now this worksheet's just giving us information that we're going to need to know in order to be able to calculate that. So we have our 300 units. It's telling us that the materials cost was $61.19. The conversion cost was $39.20. And then we have production started. That was in June, 6,000 units. Production completed during June was 5,400 units. So the cost added to the production during June was, the materials cost was $118,621, and the conversion cost was $81,130. So we have an ending work in process units of 900 units, and it gives us the percentage completion again for materials 60%, conversion 30%. All right, so that's just our information that we need. All right, the formula for computing the cost per equivalent unit. So we have the weighted average method, which is what we're going to be looking at. So we have cost per equivalent unit equals the cost of the beginning work in process inventory plus what's added during the period. So the two costs that we just saw was beginning cost plus the cost that was added. We have to add those together and then divide them by the equivalent units of production. So remember, that's not just the units that were completed and pulled out. It tells us the equivalent units are the completed units, plus we have to calculate out what that work in process ending equivalent unit is. That's what the total equivalent units are. So that's what we need to use when we do this formula. All right, so let's go back to the example with the one that we've been working with. So we did the units, now we're going to look at the costs. So we have our work in process on June 1. We have our material and our conversion costs broken out and then added together for $10,000. And then we have the assembly, that the cost that was added to the assembly during the month of June. We have materials and conversion costs, when added together, it's 199,000. So we have a total cost of 209,790. And then it shows us what the total cost is for materials and what the total cost is for conversion. It also gives us what our equivalent units were. So we've already calculated out the equivalent units. Some of the homework for the homework, I think, has multiple steps. You may have to do what the equivalent units are and then calculate the costs. So you might have to figure out what the equivalent units are first in order to figure out the cost. All right. So how do we figure out the cost per unit? So this is similar to what we did on that job cost sheet. Remember, we had that total cost and we divided it by the unit in order to figure out what was it per unit. We're going to do the same thing here. So I'm going to break it out to know what the materials cost is per unit and what is the conversion cost per unit. So all we're doing is taking the total cost divided by the number of units. So for materials, we have the 124,740 divided by the 5940. That gives us $21. So if they want to know in the question, what's the material equivalent unit cost, it would be 21. And then we have the conversion, 85,050 divided by 5670 units, which is $15. So if they want to know what the total cost per equivalent unit is, we have to add them together, the 21 plus the $15. So that gives us $36. So just pay attention to what the question's asking for. All right, we want to assign cost to the unit using the weighted average. All right. So we have our materials in the ending work in process inventory, 540 and 270. So remember, that is our calculation that we already did. It was the 900 units that we had in ending inventory, the work in process ending inventory, and then we multiplied it by the percentages, the 16 to 30%. That's where those numbers are coming from. So we have 540 for materials, 270 for conversion. We know the cost per equivalent unit. We just calculated that. So we have $21 and $15. So now we multiply to get the number. So we take 540 equivalent units, multiply it by $21 to come up with the total material cost of the ending work in process inventory, which is $11,340 for materials and $4,050 for conversion. And then it gives us our total on the end, $15,390. So that is what the cost is going to be for the ending work in process. Remember, we pulled those other units out, that 5,400 units. So you definitely don't want to use that in your work in process number. Okay, work in process are the ones that were still not completed. Those are the ones we still have to work on to complete for the next period. So don't bring in that 5,400 here. All right, so now we have our units completed and transferred out. So what did we transfer out? 5,400 units. What's the cost per equivalent unit? 21 and 15. We multiply to come up with our cost that's transferred out. So the cost for the ending work in process is going to be those units that were left behind with their percentages, and then the cost of the units that were transferred out is the 5,400, and you multiply that by the rate per unit that we calculated out on the previous slide. So we have a total cost transferred out of 194,400. All right, so now we're going to look at a reconciliation sheet. That is going to let us know if we did everything correct. The number should be the same when we finished. All right, cost to be accounted for. So we had the cost of the beginning work in process, which was $10,039. We added cost during the production, $199,751. The total cost to be accounted for is $209,790. So that's in both. Let me go back to a previous slide so you can see that. It was further back on that first slide that we looked at. Right here, you see how it's got the total cost there? So that's the information that we were given on this sheet. It told us what those costs were, and it was the $209,790 for the total cost. That's where that's coming from. Okay. So cost accounted for as follows. So we have the cost of ending work in process inventory that we calculated out based on our percentage completion for materials and conversion costs. So those units times the dollar amount was 15,390. That was my work in process ending inventory. And then I had the units that were transferred out that we calculated. That was the 5,400 times that 21 and 15. So that gave me the 194.4. And I came up with a total of 209,790, and they match. So we looked at what was given to us on that front screen, you know, what that beginning inventory was, what was the amount of the cost that was brought into production, add them together, and that should match what you come up with in the end, what's getting pulled out, and then what's left in work in process. All right, so this last slide is just saying that we also have something called operation costing. It's a hybrid between job order costing and process costing. It possesses attributes from both approaches. It's commonly used when you have different products that pass through the same processing department. So maybe you work for a plant that, you know, they produce puddings and tapioca and yogurts. And so maybe you have a little bit different variation in your products, but they pass through that same processing department. They may use a hybrid of both the job order costing and the process costing. So that is it for chapter 4. And that concludes what will be on the chapter 1 test. So we have that first chapter that goes through kind of all the basic information that you're going to be doing in a lot of terms. And then we have that job order costing in 2 and 3, where you learn how the money's flowing through the 3 different buckets and being moved in, how you do the journal entries for that. And then we move into the process costing, which is basically the same thing of how it's moving through, but it's showing you something a little bit different because you have to calculate the equivalent units. So that's the new addition to in this chapter to what you've been doing. Okay, so do y'all have any questions on chapter 4?
No.
No, sorry, I was muted.
Okay. What about for the homework?
Is chapter 4 a part of the upcoming test?
Chapter 4, yes, it's 1 through 4 on test 1.
And that's next week, correct?
The schedule changed and I put a new schedule on Canvas. Let me end the slideshow and we'll look at that real quick. I had to move some things around. So the test is not going to be for next week. It's actually going to be the following week. So next week we're going to meet and do we're going to do a lecture on chapter 5 next week. And then we'll have the test the following week. So you actually have 2 weeks to prepare for this test for chapters 1 through 4. Hang on, I'm signing in now, so I'm getting there.
So the test is not next week, it's the week after.
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay, so we're going over chapter 5 next week, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So we'll do a lecture next week on October 5th for chapter 5. That won't be on the test, but we're going to do the lecture that night. And then we're going to do the test on the 12th for chapters 1 through 4. And hold on, I'm getting ready to bring up the schedule. All right, so on Canvas, you'll see under the welcome section, there's a revised schedule. All right, let me reshare my screen. Okay, so you should see the schedule. All right, so on Canvas, there's a revised schedule. So we're gonna, I don't know why it doesn't have, that's weird. Why it doesn't have anything here. Does yours look like that?
Yes, it's blank right there.
It is blank. Okay, so I'm gonna have to repost it then because obviously you can't follow the schedule if it's blank. So don't remember if I did it at work or at home. I'm pulling up my file right now to see if I have it so we can look at the Excel document. I know that I typed it on there, so I'm not sure what happened when I converted it to a PDF. Let's see, counting fall 2023. No, it's probably on my work computer. I probably did it at the office. So all right, I'm gonna bring up the old schedule just so you can see it and we'll go over it real quick. So basically, we are swapping. This is going here and this is going there. So that week of October 9th, so the test is going to be October 12th. The lecture is on October 5th. All right, so we'll have chapter 5 lecture on the 5th, test on the 12th, and then the next Thursday is the 19th. That's right here this week. So the 19th, we'll do chapter 6. That's going to stay in place. And then we're going to switch these two out as well. So we won't have the exam until the week of the 30th, which is going to be November 2nd. So exam 2, October 12th. Exam 3, it's going to be November 2nd. And I'll fix that schedule for you. I'll put it on Canvas tonight. So, so that way we'll lecture on chapter 5 next week. You'll have the break for the test. Then the next week on the 19th, we'll have chapter 6. So then I'll give you 2 more weeks before the exam. And you can prepare. So we'll lecture on 7, but that won't be on test 3. It'll be just the 2 chapters, 5 and 6. And that way it gives you 2 weeks. And if you have any questions during that time, you can always email me. If we need to set up something, that's fine too. We can do that. Just let me know. And, you know, if I need to go over something or if there's a problem on homework, I can always record an example and push it out to the class if I need to do that. Depending on how y'all feeling with the information. But the 2 key things here are exam 2 is moved to the 12th of October and exam 3 is going to be on November 2nd. So that means midterm grades are due on the 11th of October. So those are just going to be, your midterm grades will just be from your first test and the homework. So if you didn't do so well on the homework, don't freak out on the midterm exam. We still have time. There'll be some extra credit assignments throughout the rest of the semester. I usually throw up an extra credit for exam 2, 3, and 4 to try to capture any of the problems that were missed on the test that maybe I feel like I want that, you know, you to go over it and do some more work on it just to make sure we understand some of the concepts there. So I'll push out some extra credit. And so there'll be opportunity to make up some points there. And then the homework is going to be a test grade at the end. So if you can get as many points on that as possible, that'll help as well. So just letting you know that midterm is only going to be that first test. So
I have a question. So like on the one on October 12th, it's going to be like last time where it's posted on Thursday and then it's due on Sunday or Monday?
Yes, Sunday. It'll be from Thursday to Sunday.
Thank you.
Yep, I'll have all my tests that way just so that it gives you enough time to fit it in on one of those days. It's that way it's a little bit flexible. So exam 2 is going to be chapters 1 through 4, and then exam 3 is going to be chapters 5 and 6. And then we'll have, you know, the last test on 7, 8, and 10. And we'll have 10 questions that'll come from chapters 1 through 6 as well. but I will give you a study guide for that, and you'll have that information so that you'll know what questions are going to be asked and how to solve those. And
Quick
then,
question.
yeah,
So I'm reading, it says on Monday, December 4th, there's no final exam for this class.
correct.
Okay, perfect.
Yep. It's just 4 exams. That last week you'll have your finals, and you won't have one for this class. Those 10 questions will be on exam 4. And let me think if there was anything else. I was thinking I was wanting to say one more thing and I can't remember. Oh, so the study guides will be posted on Canvas as well. So I'll try to get that up before this weekend. I know you have 2 weekends to work on studying for the test. So but I'll still get it up this weekend. That way you'll have that if you want to start studying for chapters 1 through 4. I'll have that up. And so I want you to focus on what's on the study guide. I go through the test and the questions that I've pulled through, and I put the study guide together based on what those questions are. It may not be till Saturday evening. There's some questions that I'm changing on the exam. So I'm going to have to change my study guide a little bit to pull off some and maybe add some depending on what I change. So I'll probably have that study guide up on Saturday. It's a lot of information, and the homeworks are really, tough sometimes. And just keep in mind that, on a test, it's timed. We don't have the opportunity to go through in detail, every part of a question like that. So, so it won't be as complicated. And then there will be a couple of questions on the test that change the numbers every time you open that problem. So I can open up a couple of problems that you can work through as a practice before the exam. And that way you can kind of figure out what the system's asking for and how to work through those problems before you actually take the test. The numbers will be different, but that'll help you on a couple of the questions that are going to be on the test. So that's a little bit of an advantage as well. You'll have that going into it. So so make sure you practice those problems that open up for the practice, because they'll be the exact same question that's on the test. It's just changing the numbers. I want to make sure you know how to work through them. So so you'll have that, and then you'll have the study guide as well. And so I'm trying to give you all the tools necessary. If you put the work in and you do the practice, you do the homework, you should be fine on those exams. There won't be any surprises. Okay, so do y'all have any questions on any of the test information? I'll make sure I get the schedule up tonight. Or do you have any questions on the homework from last week?
No.
Okay.
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. Well, then that's it for tonight. And email me if you have any issues or need to ask a question or schedule some time with me. And I guess that's it. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
All
You
right.
as
Thank
well.
you all.